Good afternoon. I've been asked to introduce myself, so it's going to be a great introduction. But my name is Greg Brown. I graduated in 1973 from Virginia Polytechnic Institute, and I have degrees in mechanical engineering and nuclear engineering. As far as my main credentials go, I was president and CEO of a number of companies. I was president and CEO of Schneider Electric in Latin America, which was one of the top 30 companies in size for all Latin America. I was also president and CEO of Schneider Canada, which was the top 20, one of the top 20 companies in Canada. I went on, became president and CEO of Xantrax. Anybody who owns boats knows trace inverters. I was involved in making that, putting that company on the public Toronto Stock Exchange. So we took it from a private company to a public company. And the last major thing I did is I bought a division of a Fortune 500 company, took it private to avoid Sarbanes-Oxley. And after taking private, I sold out my interest, retired, and moved to the greatest state in the world right here in Alaska. For the last 10 years, I've lectured at Harvard. I've written case studies for them, and I don't have an MBA, but I speak at the MBA program up there. And the way they explain it, they invite me up to speak about these case studies because they put together these huge strategies that are very complex, and my job is to take those strategies and put them into 6 or 7 pages and make them into something you can really do. I've done business in over 100 countries. My wife and I have been coming up to Alaska for over 30 years. I'm also a commercial pilot and a boat captain up here in Alaska right now. Make sure I have this right. Here we go. This is my standard disclaimer. Part of what I do for a living, and I'm not a biologist, and I'm not a great photographer and a philosopher like many other people in the room, is I look at businesses, and I get invited to look at businesses that are usually failing, not doing well, and they can be losing $50, $100 million, and I'm asked to change the strategy and make them work. And I've never tried to put values on living beings before, and living like whales and wolves, but that's what I'm going to try to do today, because it seems like the only thing the government ever looks at is the money side of things and the financial side of things. I don't oppose guns. In fact, I have a lot of guns. Alex has seen a lot of my guns, and I'm not opposed to hunting. I have hunted a lot in my life. So with that, we'll switch things around, and we're going to talk about buggy whips. This is an incredible story about buggy whips. In 1900, there were 200 manufacturers of buggy whips in North America. Only the wealthy people had buggies, and the whip was really the thing that really set them apart. Some of these had ivory handles. They were incredibly and beautiful items, and they sold for literally $1,000, which back then was a lot of money but this is what the elite had. Now, in 1905, they started to see their business go down, and something else happened in 1905. Henry Ford really started producing cars, but the buggy whip people, being the elite, and the manufacturers, they refused to accept the cars were taking any of the business away, so they figured it must be something else. So they looked at ways to changing the design of the buggy whips, and that didn't help. Then they looked at automating the buggy manufacturing itself. They saw what Henry Ford was doing with assembly lines and those things, and maybe they could automate it, they could make the buggy less expensive, and they could change that. And that didn't help either. So then they tried to package the buggy whip, the horse and the buggy, and that didn't help either. Through a period of 10 years there, from about 1905 to 1915, the buggy whip sales went down about 40%. And a lot of people were in the verge of bankruptcy. So when you're in this situation, and they're still in the state of denial, because they thought the car was just a fad, what do? You make a movie. And that's exactly what they did. One of the very first ads, commercials on film, was done about the buggy whip. And when you went to the movies, and they were silent movies back then, you went to see Charlie Chaplin, who was up here, and he'd be walking around with his cane like everybody's seen. But before that movie came on, you might see an ad 20 seconds long about buggy whips. Well, that didn't help either, but it was an interesting approach to the business. And what happened is all these manufacturers of buggy whips went out of business except for one. And that manufacturer, when he was asked why he didn't go out of business, he said, "I never looked at myself as a buggy whip manufacturer. I looked at myself as a manufacturer of accelerating devices. And he went on to become the #1 supplier to Henry Ford for the linkages for the throttles for the Model T. So with that background, and we'll tell you the rest of that story a little bit later, let's start talking about numbers, which are really kind of surprising. If we look at the, now I understand this doesn't capture all the financials for the hunting industry, but this is a good core and a good way to measure because it's pretty measurable and the number is pretty accurate. But if we look at the hunting licenses in Alaska, it's only about a little over $6 million business for the hunting licenses. And going back to what Alex's point was earlier, this demographic is getting older and older because fewer and fewer people are hunting. And so what's happened with big game tags, which is they've gone down 39% since 2000 to 2009. Now you would think with this intensive game management program and this so-called management for abundance that this number should be going up. I mean, we're trying to get all these animals created in order to promote out-of-state hunting and all the things you hear about, but that's not what's happening. And these numbers, by the way, are right off the Alaska Department of Fish and Game website. So there's nothing, no sleight of hand here. It's interesting to note that these numbers are going down at about the same rate of the buggy whip manufacturers. They went down 40% in 10 years, and we're down to 39% in 9 years. So what's happening to wildlife? Down at the bottom, you see the cost of the intensive game management program. This year is budgeted at about $3.9 million. It's up 3%, and it's been going up 3% now for about the last 10 to 12 years, 3 or 4%. But look at the big game tags, $3.3 million. And there should be some kind of relationship there because really the intensive game management program is aimed at the big game, making it available. So right now we're spending almost $4 million as a state to make $3.3 million. And as Dr. Phil would say, you know, how is that working for you? And this spread is getting bigger and bigger every year. We kept throwing more and more money at it, just like the buggy whips, make automation and production line. And we throw more money at it, and the business keeps going away from us. And basically what we have here is on an annual basis, we have a failed business that's being bailed out by the state money. And so they keep throwing more and more money at to try to offset this $3.34 million, which is going down. If we look at the cost of this game management, we've created no jobs other than other jobs for intensive game management. We've had no growth in this industry in over a decade. Non-resident licenses are down 28% over the last 9 years. Resident hunting license revenues are down 8% over the last 9 years. So here we are. We have, it looks kind of like the buggy whip thing. We have no scientific rationale. As Vic pointed out very eloquently, we have no biological rationale for this, and we have no fundamental or financial rationale. It doesn't make sense financially what we're doing. So what do we do next? We make a movie. This just came out about 2 weeks ago, and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Wildlife, is soliciting services to spend $100,000 in producing a videotape about predator control management. And this is that last step in the process, which quite often you see happen, where, you know, our strategy's got to be right, so everybody else in the world must be wrong. And so that's what this movie is going to be about. I know this sounds kind of silly, but if you look at the history of industry in the United States, the Dow Jones Industrials came out in 1928. There are 30 Dow Jones 30 Industrials. There's only one company that's still around that was on that original list. And the majority of the reason those companies failed was the fact that they didn't make the paradigm shifts they needed to keep the company alive and vibrant. And I think that's a little bit what we're seeing here. Well, I know it's late in the afternoon, and Vic had a lot of information, and Alex and other folks on the subject, so I tried to just do a flow chart to make it pretty easy to understand where we're headed. And I think we're headed there pretty fast. Looking at the stated reasons for intensive game management. Low-income people, 20%, first of all, only 20% of the people in Alaska hunt, and only 20% of those people fit into the low income. So we're not talking about a huge number of people fitting in that area. 80% of those hunters are urban hunters. There's a film out, in fact, maybe we'll see it, I don't know if we're going to see it tomorrow or not, but there's a film out showing people driving around on the road up between Fairbanks and Anchorage. And when they see an animal, then they pull off and they go shoot the animal. I mean, this is not really sport hunting. And those urban hunters, most of them, in fact, several of them, are with the Board of Fish and Game, and so they're actually very well paid people. This is not a subsistence issue. Bring money in from out-of-state hunters. Non-resident hunting licenses are down by 28%. So obviously the strategy is not working. The other issue that you hear a lot about is culture. And with the native culture, I mean, prior to the white man coming up here, they lived pretty well for 10,000 years. They had a pretty good harmony with nature. They understand that a lot. And I really feel that that low income, which a lot of that is native, traditional people who live off the land, they should have the first priority of any animals in Alaska. And if we're in an area of low abundance, we should just keep the urban people out and out-of-state people out, and that should be their area. But I tried to go back, and I've only lived in Alaska 4 years, so I tried to go back and I probably had 100 different pieces of literature talking about the culture, and I found some interesting things. And this is from UAF. Alaska was really the first state in the United States to actually have a wolf introduction program. And this was in 1960. There was an island which was covered with black-tailed deer, and the Alaska Fish and Game, the biologists thought, well, geez, we ought to introduce wolves into this area, and they'll take care of this problem. They introduced the wolves, and I won't go through the whole story. In fact, Vic probably knows a lot better than I do, but they introduced the wolves, and what happened? The wolves didn't survive. The deer did fine, and the deer, but all the wolves ended up dying. But it was really cutting-edge technology back then for anybody to start introducing wolves. This is another fascinating story. This is a book that Jim Valentine was kind enough to give to me. Jim's our Juno filmmaker, which you'll be, if you come to the show tonight or you come back here tomorrow night, you'll get to see the trailer for the movie on the Tongass that he filmed last year. Yeah, incredible filmmaker. But anyway, this is a book that was put out by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, 1977. And you can see photos taken from the big game contest. And I wanted to read just one little piece to you about it. And this is from the introduction. The 1975 Alaska Big Game Photography Contest was created by the Alaska Legislature to encourage people to appreciate the state's 13 species of big animals, and not just for meat and trophies, but as the most beautiful facet of the 49th state. To emphasize this concept of total appreciation, the legislature decided to limit the contest to photographers taken by people who did not harvest the same species of game during that year. Contestants vied for prizes from $25 honorable mention up to $10,000 for the best single entry. Now think about that, $10,000 for a picture. That's $30,000 in today's dollars. That's a big number. And they had 26 prizes at $1,000. And here they say capturing Alaska's animals in their natural setting on film is oftentimes more difficult and time-consuming venture and much more difficult than just shooting them. So there was actually, in 1975, a culture that existed at the Fish and Game and at the legislature that recognized that there was a big advantage and the value to preserving wildlife. And it's a really neat book, and I'll have it up here afterward if you'd like to see it. So if we move along to the bigger numbers, this, according to the Department of Interior, and this is the best number I could get for all of hunting, hunting's worth $124 million in the state of Alaska. That's actually not really a big number. I mean, I would have thought it had been a lot more, and in fact, I was very surprised. So let's compare that to wildlife viewing in the state of Alaska. $581 million. Now, $581 million sounds like a huge number, and it's 5 times the size of hunting revenue. But the market right now for wildlife viewing in the lower 48 is a $29 billion market. If you go through the math on that, it means we're not even in the top half of the states. We live in Alaska. We got all these animals, all this opportunity to show off what we have, and more people go to Alabama to see animals and come here. What is wrong with this picture? I tried an experiment here, and it turned out just that it actually coincided with some other work that was being done that I didn't know about. Approximately 200,000 people a year come to Juneau and go whale watching. And I have a little whale watching business, but if you look at the big boys, Allen Marine and Orca and some of those, the number comes out to be about 200,000. If you talk to NOAA, there's about 60 whales that we go out and see, and most of the time they come back year after year after year. And that's pretty well documented. The average whale watching trip exceeds $100 per person. So when I put out of the harbor and we get on the other side of Coghlan Island and I see a whale, it goes $100 a person, cha-ching. You can imagine what you are if you're on Allen Marine boat. That makes the market more than $20 million annually for the city of Juneau. That's a huge amount of money. It truly is. And these are people who come up to see a whale. And I talk to people every day who are coming up this summer to see whales. I mean, they really want to see them. It's a very important part of their trip. I apologize for the pictures best I can do. Nick would have much better pictures than I have. Therefore, if you look at the value of a whale annually, it's about $333,000. Whales live to be at least 80 years old. There's some estimates at 135 years, which puts the value of them at over $26 million in current dollars over an 80-year period. There is not another asset in Juneau that's worth $26 million, let alone it doesn't depreciate for 80 years. I mean, this is a businessman's dream to have something like this, and you don't even have to manufacture the product. It's sitting there. If you look at the value of bears, we did the same thing with bears. We looked at Pack Creek, $480 to have Butch fly over to Pack Creek, and I do some bear viewing over there last year. And if you simply go through the math, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quick that these animals are worth a lot more alive than they are dead. I did an informal survey about wolves last year, actually, and this was only done with about 500 people. But I asked them if I could guarantee you to see a wolf, what would you pay to go on a trip with me? And the number was about $500. Well, this isn't a scientific survey, and when I was young and doing this thing for a living, I mean, I would have just blown this thing off. But we have a little bit more credible source than that. This is what CNN says, and this is what the study was on Yellowstone. When they put wolves in there, it expanded their annual revenue by $35 million. Go through the math on that. A wolf in Yellowstone is worth $500,000 apiece. I'm embarrassed that their wolf is worth more than ours. Ours is only worth about $134,000 to go through the numbers, but it's still a lot more than you get. We're paying $5 for license to go shoot a wolf, which is really what we pay up here. This business is expanding, and there's a new business opening up right here in Juneau this year to go view bears. And you go out of Ock Bay, you get in a boat, you'll see some whales on the way to Hoonah. You go on a bear viewing trip over there, and you get in an airplane, you fly back, and get back in your cruise ship. $600 a person. And think about all the people you can put on a boat. You know, they're going to be taking 40 people at a time. They can do a couple trips a day. It's a lot of money. So these really have a very high value. If we look at Denali, and use the numbers up there. Yeah, 415,000 visitors, $63 million. You go through the same calculation, you look at the value of a wolf up there, it's about $137,000. Bears and moose are worth similar value. If you go through that calculation, it's about $131,000. These are huge numbers. They truly are. And it's a huge opportunity for Alaska. I think I've said this a few times, no need to say it again right now. As I said, I'm not against hunting, and I grew up hunting. And my brother hunts in Africa and a lot of other places, and it's one thing it does is he and I have discussions a lot about is why it costs, when he goes to Africa hunting, it costs him $50,000, and if he comes to Alaska, it costs him $15,000. How can we discount our game so, which is absolutely true. It's a very cheap place to hunt. But we should consider looking at out-of-state hunters and urban hunters, people who do not need the food to survive. So looking at paying a fair price for these animals, or something higher than what we're paying today. The Alaskan hunter, as I say, only represents 20% of the population. And a lot of people enjoy watching animals. There's a huge value there. And from our point of view being just fellow Alaskans, especially those that are non-consumptive people, if you look at the last line down here, basically what's happening is we're spending this extra money in intensive game management to subsidize this business, and really that means we as Alaskans are subsidizing that business. Why shouldn't we, like any good management group, make it so it at least has to make some kind of financial sense in addition to biological sense and other things? If we look at it another way, we spend $10,000 a day on this program, which if you go down to Fred Meyer's, that would be 1,331 pounds of meat you could give away every day. Almost 500,000 pounds of meat. And if you reverse the direction and look at what we spend on this intensive game management in these predator control areas, and you go through the number of moose that have been shot in those areas because of it, that moose meat is worth about $30 a pound. So it's a pretty expensive way if that's the only reason we're doing it. What Alex said earlier is that, hunters' revenues have been going down for years, and so what we're seeing here is not unusual, that the revenues have been heading south, and there's no sign it's ever going to change. It's a pretty good indicator when you watch the lower 48 all go down that we're going to follow at some point in time, and we are actually following very well for at least 10 years. Here's some of the facts. The total U.S., the non-consumptive use for wildlife is enjoyed by over 62 million people with expenditure $29 billion a year. It's growing 6 to 10%. To look at this a little differently, if you have your IRA, you have a choice you're going to invest in. You can invest in a consumptive business, which is going down 39% over a 10-year period, and there's no growth there, and we're having to pour more and more money into it. Or you can invest in wildlife viewing and a non-consumptive, which is growing 6 to 10% a year and generating huge profits. Where are you going to put your money? Pretty obvious question. One of the questions I get when I talk about things like this is that people aren't going to fly clear up to Alaska just to go see animals. It just doesn't happen anywhere. And I have an answer to that. Churchill, the polar bear capital of the world, town of 900 people that pulls in $18 million a year to go see polar bears. And the other third thing in the sign there, beluga whale capital of the world. We're looking at, we're worried about the beluga whales in Cook Inlet because it interferes with our commerce. Why don't we look at it as an opportunity to make some money for the local people? And why aren't we the beluga capital of the world? We have a lot of whales here up in Cook Inlet, a lot of belugas. Birdwatcher paradise. Now this is a town of 900 people. I was talking to another one of our local celebrities the other day, Dave Hunsacker, and he was telling me a story. They were doing a film about Alaska, and they actually filmed part of it at Churchill. And the reason being, because there wasn't a place in Alaska where you could bring a film crew in and house 100 people and see polar bears. So they actually did the filming there and then said that was the polar bears in Alaska. So if we look at the beach in Alaska, people don't go to Churchill to sit on the beach, that's for sure. They go to look at a polar bear, and polar bears like to look at them apparently too. A little better picture of a polar bear. So I've done this kind of analysis. Normally it's a lot more formal than this when I'm speaking at Harvard in particular and doing analysis. You can see a lot of sheets with numbers, and I tried to avoid that today. But the conclusion of it, if this Alaska Wildlife were a company in which one division was becoming unprofitable, you continue with that business with minimum resources and focus your main resources on the growing profitable sector of your business. My recommendation would be to dissolve the Department of Fish and Game and replace it with the Alaska Department of Fish, Marine Mammals, and Wildlife Management. Obviously, nobody from Fish and Game is here today. The mission of that group would be to represent all Alaskans in the management of these important resources. And the goal would be to grow a vibrant, non-consumptive business from $581 million to $1 billion in 5 years, and creating over 2,000 new Alaskan jobs. This is not that hard to do. I came up here 4 years ago and bought a boat, like a lot of people do. Started a business. Last year it ran the first year, and I made a kind of a high-end business of it, but it's just a six-pack boat. It's not a big deal. I wouldn't normally share these numbers, but I think it's important to talk about it. My first year's income, my top line was $92,000. I worked 5 hours a day for 90 days. And right now the business is rated as one of the best attractions in Juneau if you look at Travel Advisor and those places. These businesses are great. And if you think about it a little bit differently, if you were the president of Honda and you get up in the morning and you look out and you have your lot out there with all these cars, it's incredible, this business model. And you get up and all of a sudden the gates open and people come walking in and they start looking at these cars and writing checks and giving you checks, and geez, this is incredible business. Then you go to bed and you're thinking, wow, that was a great day. I made thousands and thousands of dollars. The next morning you get up, the same cars are there, so you didn't have to produce anything new. You go out and they're writing you checks again. That's what this business is all about. It's almost too good to be true. This is, and I'll give some credit here to Mike Peterson, who happens to be sitting up there. He looked at the Juneau Advisory Committee for the Department of Fish and Game, and he reallocated the seats so it would represent non-consumptive as well as consumptive. And I hold the non-consumptive guided seat, and Jenny Purcell, who was here earlier, holds the non-consumptive wildlife seat. And so I am copying a little bit of what he said here, and I tried to look it down at how people allocate it to a fair division of how people actually use the resources, these wildlife resources. And I ended up with, this is just the wildlife management group, so this would be substitute for the Board of Game. One hunting seat, one trapping seat, one native interest seat, one land non-consumptive seat, one birding seat, and one marine non-consumptive seat, to give a fair representation. I would also recommend we have a chair, which is down at the bottom. He would not be voting. He'd be helping work on the agenda and also coordinate with the other committees, the marine mammals and also the fishery seat. We'd have a biologist seat to make sure we had accurate information. And we'd have a business management seat. And this guy would have two jobs. Every proposal that comes in, we look at the financial implications of that proposal. And the second thing is, every time there's an opportunity to help somebody start a small business up for animal viewing, whether it be in Prince of Wales, be in the interior, or be in a number of other places all across Alaska, which is just waiting for somebody to do that, he would be involved in helping develop that and working with the local small business chambers and those kind of things to get that business up and running to bring more jobs and more money into Alaska. Tourism is a sustainable money pipeline in Alaska. Oil isn't. We're going to run out sooner or later. In fact, it's going down now. But tourism can last virtually forever. And it's incredible. People come, they visit, they see a wolf, bear, whale. They leave a lot of money and then they go home. And business doesn't get any better than that. And it's a lot better than having relatives come visit too. So why are we in the lower half of the United States in regard to attracting wildlife viewing? And a couple reasons. Number one is we aren't friendly to tourists. We put head count taxes on tourists coming in on cruise ships, and some of that's used for the areas and some of it's used for an interior. We have water requirements that the Navy had to ask for a waiver on because they couldn't meet the Alaska water requirements because they said the technology doesn't exist to do it, and they wanted to run Navy boats into Alaskan waters. And this just reared its head to me the other day. I've had one person already cancel a trip who was booked with me for the year because they are boycotting Alaska until we stop targeting wolves with this predator control program. To the legislators, and I'm going to be going around and talking to a lot of them in person in the next couple of weeks. I'm not asking them to become greenies, not even conservationists. I'm asking them to become responsible business people representing the economic interest of all Alaskans by growing a vibrant business and creating thousands of new environmentally friendly jobs. And I think that's a fair thing to ask of them. So here we are. Do you want to be a buggy whip manufacturer in a slowly declining industry? Or do you want to be an accelerator manufacturer in a high-growth industry and bring money and new jobs into Alaska and manage all wildlife for abundance? You're the board of directors. You make the votes. What do you want to do? Thank you very much. Any questions at all?
Yeah, I worked for 6 years for Department of Fish and Game running the wildlife viewing program and left for many reasons that relate to how it's managed now and what's going on at Fish and Game. One of the issues that we had was that the Division of Wildlife Conservation is funded primarily through this excise tax on the sale of guns and ammunition. Not just hunters, but anybody who buys guns and ammunition. And then it's matched with money from hunting license fees. When I worked there, I bought a hunting license there every year, even though I didn't hunt, just to be my share of paying. We tried to put different measures through the legislature to have wildlife viewers, create a mechanism for wildlife viewers to voluntarily or by requirement for commercial wildlife viewers, put money in, and we couldn't get any traction on that. The big thing is, how are wildlife viewers going to step up and pay has been one of the political things. Wondering how you...
Yep. Well, first of all, let me answer the question. And I'll come back directly to that answer, but there's something else that I probably should be saying in regards to that. What happened between when we were having photo contests and today? And that was 1975, and thanks to Jim Valentine, I had the opportunity to spend some time talking to Jim Fowler, and many of you might remember him from Wild Kingdom days, and probably there would not be wild animals and big game in Africa today if it wasn't for him. And he happened to be up here at the time, and it was really interesting what he told me. He said there was a sentiment toward, viewing animals and having value to that. But in 1975, oil money was coming into Alaska, and this money was coming into people who did not have a lot of money traditionally, and the corporations were looking back at it and coming up with strategies to extract that money from them in return for their products. They put literally millions of dollars into lobbyists to basically hijack the Board of Game and also change the legislature and their constitution was actually changed at least twice on this event. And so that's kind of how we got today, where we are at today. There's no reason if we wanted to, well, first of all, the first thing I do is to stop this intensive game management, take that $4 million and put it into developing the wildlife viewing. But we could also put a tax on binoculars and other things that you use for wildlife viewing, if that's what we had to do. But when you're bringing in $500 million in new business into the state, there has got to be a way to fund something like that, because we're not looking for a lot of money to get it going. Did that answer your question?
It explores it. I spent quite a few years on this very topic and going around it, and our legislature and our politics are ripe for some really big changes.
Well, I think they are, and the other flip side of that is that, you know, these big corporations, when they start organizing, and having been head of a big billion-dollar company, and I know we sit around and we have strategies about what we're going to do to manipulate governments, and we manipulated the U.S. government, we manipulated Guatemala, you name it, we did it. So I can sympathize with everything Alex is saying, and the pressure you get from private investors, venture capitalists, which they will slit your throat and fire you if you don't return 35% in their investment, literally in year two. It's a ruthless environment those corporations set up, and they will do anything to be able to extract money from individuals for the sales of their products. I was one, I know.
Yeah, I'd like to know more about this watchable wildlife industry that you're talking about. I think you said $29 billion for the country. What are the major segments of that? I mean, assuming that includes you know, tourism to rural areas and petting zoos, and what are the major components of that pie?
Well, I'm not sure petting zoos are included, but basically what they do is they look at the parks like Yellowstone, which you can really measure that easily. Then they look at Alabama. The reason I pick on Alabama is everybody thinks that's southern state, you know, but they do more than we do. And why? Because they have a bird watching track that you run on. It goes all the way around the state, and you can actually get at this trail, and you stay at this one place one night, and the next night you stay somewhere else, and they have another bird thing, and so on. And you can go around the entire state, because they actually plan to bring people in to look at the value of the different animals in Alabama. And there's actually quite a difference. You're north, you're in the mountains. You know, south, you're on the water, and so they have different stories to tell. In California, you know, we have a lot of parks there, and a lot of areas where people go see the redwoods and so on. Florida, you know, the Everglades there have been a lot of management issues with the Everglades, but they really do attract a lot of people, and people spend a lot of money to go there, and we just aren't going after that business. I mean, we're, you know, half the size of the United States or more. We have the best animals in the world. So why aren't we going after it? And I don't know.
I remember when the photo contest was going on, and that, of course, was a special legislative appropriation for, like you said, large prize cash awards. And I believe that, and at the same time, the Department of Fish and Game also had a pretty good magazine that they would publish. I think it was called Fish Tales and Game Trails. I might be mistaken, but it was a good, high-quality magazine, and many of the articles in that magazine were not only related to hunting and fishing, but to viewing. And the legislature, about the time that the intensive management law passed, and actually even before that, the legislature made a real turnaround in how it viewed the Department of Fish and Game and its responsibilities. Let me give you one example as to how far it went. In 1996, some of the Fairbanks legislators, who have always been the spark plugs behind predator control, were dissatisfied with the pace that was going on. The intensive management law had passed in '94, and the department really hadn't implemented much of it by '96. And so those Fairbanks legislators had enough clout that they actually got into, in committee action, they actually got into the enabling legislation for the Department of Fish and Game. And they were literally going through that and striking out the word conservation wherever it occurred. Because to them, conservation equals greenies, equals anti-wolf control, equals, you know, let's get rid of it. And so I think the reason why we don't have the magazine anymore and why we don't have the photo contest or anything like it, and the reason, and you know, is simply because the legislature changed its whole attitude and became totally focused on predator control. Another example, McNeil River bears, one of the crown jewels of wildlife viewing in the world. You know, a few years ago, there were proposals to open hunting, literally right up to the boundary of some of those sanctuary and preserves. And it almost happened, you know, and it was only through actually what the angle was. Sorry to be long-winded, but that's my nature. What the angle was is the game board said, okay, National Park Service has some lands that we would like to engage in a land swap with. And so in order to put pressure on the Park Service to swap these lands within the Katmai Preserve, we're going to hold this proposal to hunt bears in that area over the Park Service's head, and hopefully that'll accomplish the land swap. Well, it never did. But anyway, those are examples of how bad some of this stuff got.
Well, it's incredible to me that we're sitting here with this huge opportunity for animal viewing, and what are we doing? We're getting rid of the buffer zone in Denali. We're selling bear parts, which, I mean, that's just amazing to me. We'd be going backwards that far. You know, and they were saying, well, we're not going to sell gallbladders. But, you know, you look at all the drugs and stuff that gets smuggled in and out of Alaska. I mean, if you're selling bear parts, it's going to be easy to get a gallbladder in there, here and there, and you could start exporting those too. I mean, it's fact of life. We can't stop it once you start it. Yes?
You stole my thunder. I was just going to add to what Vic said about being against tourism in areas in McNeil River. I mean, we just eliminated the Denali buffer zone. I went and spent all my vacation money every year for 30 years before I moved here to go to Denali in an effort to see wolves. And so instead of promoting something like that, we eliminate the buffer zone, despite all the letters and the comments from the people who run the park, just for a minority of recreational trappers, the way I've read it. But we're doing that even worse now.
I tried to do an analysis. I didn't present it today, but is it possible to have a $1 billion hunting industry up here? And the answer is you can't even get to $1 billion if you killed every animal up here in 1 year. There's no possibility of that. And I would challenge anybody from Fish and Game to put together a strategy that gives me a $1 billion industry by using predator control and by using hunting, and we'll compare it to the strategy about using viewing and renewable resources, and I would bet I would win every time. In fact, I'd put $100,000 of my own money up to bet against them. If you find any of those guys, Denby or any of those people who wanted to bet, make that bet, send them on.
I have actually a question for you. As I hear you speak, it's almost like, in the positive sense, you're channeling Barry Goldwater, so, you know, the author of Conscience of a Conservative. And I don't think that he would agree with subsidizing a dying business or a business that at least that's declining. That what you're saying is that what's occurring now is not economically rational. And at least in my opinion, certainly Barry Goldwater was a good fiscal conservative, and I look at our more recent, I would say in Alaska, I don't consider Palin or Parnell to actually be true conservatives in that sense, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that matter.
Well, I think your comments are very well taken. The other thing is these numbers, some of them were easy to get, but the ones like the cost of intensive game management was not easy to get. They're very secretive numbers. And I can't remember the guy's name even, but when you had when there was a presentation in this room about a year ago, pro predator control, they refused to give any economic numbers. So they know it's not true. I took a pretty objective look at this, and it doesn't make any economic sense. Nobody would run a business like this unless you could get the government to give you a bunch of money so I can stay employed, I can expand my kingdom, if you will. And the interesting thing about it, if we change it to wildlife viewing, we're going to employ more people. Nobody goes away. Well, maybe some particular individuals go away. But in the majority, we'll be hiring more people. It won't be less. And we'll be bringing more money into the state. But I think this is a pretty objective look at the business in a quick overview. Okay?
Any other questions?
While he's taking that microphone over there, if you haven't looked at that, about Yellowstone, and about what wonderful things have happened because of introduction of wolves, and it's more than just the $35 million. It's wonderful things that happen to the ecosystems.
So Greg, I'm persuaded, right? I think this is a good idea, but I wonder, and I'm thinking about the phrase that Alex used in his presentation about this notion that there's kind of unlimited growth potential here. Are there limits to this? I mean, obviously, if the animal's still alive, at some point, the experience changes. I mean, it's much different to go and see a bear at the glacier than it is to encounter one somewhere else. And how many places are there that you can encounter a bear that kind of retain that authenticity, I guess, is my question. I mean, that's an example, but the question is, are there limits to this, basically?
Well, I think there are limits to it, but I think it was Alex had said we have what, 6.5 billion people in the world. Just run them through here let's show them some animals and see what the limit is.
Thank you. What is your?
This is going to be tough.
No.
Good.
What's the map? You had mentioned that you're going to go to the legislature here in the next couple of weeks, and are going to be
talk about this in general. Mm-hmm.
And then wrapping up the end of the session. Then it becomes an election year here in November. Do you see yourself next year also going to the Hill, and how or where do you present this? I guess is my question.
Funny you should ask. If you're not doing anything this evening, come on down to the Jack, and we have a program down there. This is going to be talked about again. Hollis French will be down there. Beth Cartula will be down there. We've already chatted with them a little bit about it. We plan to try to do our very, very best to make this an election issue. We talked to Bob Poe about it the other night, and we're having money that's being misappropriated within the state of Alaska, and this whole thing is being misrepresented, and I'm just for open and transparency. So I think it should be an election issue, and we intend to stay at this as long as we have to. Does that answer your question? We're expecting you to help us, too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I can just say in terms of the numbers you got, the 124 million, I was eagerly awaiting the numbers from Fish and Wildlife Service from that study because I had used it in 2001 to prepare a lot of similar ideas here in terms of the value. Alaska's numbers were really late coming out because the department was negotiating the value of the hunting numbers. Although this was a standardized study that's been done every 5 years for decades and decades, the department did not like the hunting number this year and held up release while they negotiated. I wasn't ever privy to what the number was before the negotiation.
Well, the numbers we have there were actually from the Federal Department of Interior. And so we tried it because we thought that would be the most consistent way to have the numbers.
Right. Those are the numbers that they were negotiating the release of.
Thank you. So you're saying they may be high?
They're bigger than they were. I'm saying they're bigger than they were when the people who are the professionals compiled the numbers from the standardized system.
They're still 1/5 the size of the alternative market. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. Sure appreciate it.